Hello, everybody. It's Dr. Shiana Reams, and I have with me Dr. Jennifer Finn from Loyola in Chicago, and I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more about her role there and her titles.
Okay, hi. So I am Associate Professor of Classical Studies, and I'm also the chair of the Classical Studies Department at Loyola University, Chicago. We have a pretty thriving classics program at a really at
Somewhere it's thriving.
yeah, at a really amazing urban Jesuit institution. And as many people probably know, liberal arts education is a really important part of the Jesuit mission and the curriculum associated with the Jesuit ideology. And so we have been a staple at Loyola for a very long time, more than 150 years. So it's great to be a part of that. And we have a pretty global focus at Loyola. So we have a Hellenistic historian who works on Egypt. I work on Alexander in the ancient Near East. We have a Greek archaeologist, a Roman legal historian. So it's a really a great program, and our classes fill up all the time. And there are a lot of people interested in Alexander. That class is very popular. So yeah, this it's a great job. I consider myself to be an ancient historian. Uh, and that changes, the topic that I work on changes all the time. So sometimes work mostly on Greece. Sometimes I work mostly on the ancient Near East, or I'm doing everything all at the same time. But it's a great life. So
Do you guys get to teach the languages there?
yes, yeah, we teach Greek and
Yes.
Latin.
So students, if you want to be able to go to a place that gives you Latin and Greek, there's your girl. Okay.
You got it. Yeah, we got it. And I am available to teach independent studies in Akkadian and Sumerian. I've done that
Cool.
before. Yep. And we have our Hellenistic literature expert also does some Middle Egyptian. So there are a lot of different options. Our theology department also teaches Biblical Greek. So yeah, we have it, and we have a really great post-bac program too for those
Cool.
students
Yeah.
who are looking to sort of bridge the gap
Yeah.
between their undergraduate education and their graduate education. So that too is a great feature at Loyola. And one of the things, I'll just put a little plug in there. One of the things that's really cool about the post-bac is that you don't have to have any Greek or Latin before you arrive. So
Really
you,
useful. Yeah.
yep, yep. So
Penn
that's
State offers some intros, but it's only for the weird things like Sumerian. They kind of expect you to already have your Greek and Latin. At least last time I looked. Now I could be speaking now wrongly. If so, I apologize. But that's really useful because getting those languages is important and hard
yeah,
these
it
days.
is.
So
It is. It
yeah.
takes time. Yeah. So most of those students work part-time, and they go to school part-time, but everybody is a part of a really strong community at Loyola. So it's
Cool.
great.
All right. So how did you get into classics in Alexander? What path did you have? Did you have one in?
I had a path. Yeah. So I started taking Latin when I was, I think, a freshman in high school.
Wow.
And the only reason I did it was because my sister had done it, and I wanted to be just like my sister. Um, but it was really clear from the very beginning that this was something that I was going to be in love with. I found Latin, the Latin language, to be a great puzzle. We didn't do a ton of civilization or history when I was in high school. And frankly, high school language teaching isn't that great anyway. But I knew right away that this was something that I was going to love. And it was because it was hard. And that came out later in life. I just like to do hard things, and this is just one of them. But I stuck with it. I applied to undergraduate as a Latin major. So I knew right away there was nothing else. I didn't even think about what potential future job prospects would look like. It didn't matter. I just wanted to do it. And my parents were very supportive. I was very lucky there. There were no discussions about what are you going to do with that. I thought probably I would end up having to be a high school Latin teacher because that was really sort of the only thing I knew up at that time. So I went to Michigan for undergrad. I did Latin and I took classical civilization courses and I was in the School of Education because I thought, okay, yeah, I have to be a Latin teacher, so I'm just going to go through, that whole process. So I went through all of that coursework. I showed up at the student teaching for the first day. That was the last thing that you had to do to get your certification. I looked at all the high schoolers in the room and I was like, nope, can't do it. Can't do it. I just couldn't do it because I took my Latin studies so seriously
Yeah.
and I didn't want to teach students, case endings and stuff. I wanted to get serious and like down and dirty with the sources. And I knew that I couldn't do it in
Yeah.
a high school setting. And so I apologized to the lead teacher and I said, I'm sorry, I have to go. So that same day I left. I left the School of Education. I marched over to the advisor in classical studies at Michigan, and this will not be the first time I marched over to her. I'll tell you that story in a second. And this is Professor Sarah Forsdyke, so she really helped me sort of shape my career. And I said to her, I said, I can't be a Latin teacher. Can you help me figure out how I can go to graduate school? Because that's clear to me now that that's what I need to do.
Yeah.
And she said, uh, sure, except for you can't really get into graduate schools unless you have both Greek and Latin. And I hadn't taken any Greek, and it was my senior year in college.
Yeah.
So that was going to be a clear problem. So what they did was they hired one of the graduate students to teach me intensive Greek over the summer,
Yeah.
and we basically applied to master's and PhD programs saying, I'm sorry I don't have Greek yet. I promise I will when I get there. Um, I'll be great, I promise. Some schools believed me, most did not, which was fine. But to my shock, Columbia believed me. And they said, hey, you can come for a master's degree. It was unfunded. But it was with the understanding that I was going to have to complete it in 1 year. So it was going to be a lot of classes, a lot of pressure. So I went to Columbia and I took 7 classes per semester. And this is, maybe,
MA level, that's
yeah,
mind-boggling.
yes, it was maybe 6 weeks after I had finished my intensive Greek course. I'm sitting there reading Herodotus with a bunch of graduate students. It was really trial by fire kind of
Yeah.
situation. But by the time that was over, I had grown up a lot. I had maintained my love for the subject, and then I applied to graduate schools with much more success in the second round. And so what ended up happening is I ended up back at Michigan because by the time I had finished at Columbia, I had realized that while I liked the languages, it was really the history that was interesting for
Sure.
me. Um, but I applied to Michigan as a Roman Republican historian, which is just shocking to me now because I really don't care for the Republic at all. And I
I'm
don't
not a
work on it.
Romanist, not a
Yeah.
Romanist.
So I don't know where I got that idea, but it doesn't matter. So I started at Michigan, and what happened was I decided to sort of take a couple of classes that were a little bit outside of my subject area, and I ended up taking art history courses with Margaret Root on Persian art, so Achaemenid Persian art. And it
Yeah.
was there that things started clicking for me. I realized that this stuff was very grand. It seemed like people hadn't really looked at it in great detail yet. And I knew by that time, since I had taken some coursework at Michigan, that military history was really interesting to me, and that Persian history was really interesting to me now. And so the way to get into that was through Alexander the Great, because, he marches his army through the largest territorial empire the world had ever seen. All I really knew about it at that point was the monumental structures that they had produced and, who were these people behind all of this stuff. It was really fascinating to me. So I started writing a dissertation I'll never forget this. I started writing a dissertation on the use of the sarissa in Alexander's army. And I was sitting in the library reading these articles by these people who have done all of this great experimental archaeology. And I thought to myself, there's nothing for me to say about this.
We know
So
one of those guys.
who are those people? Yeah, they took my topic. So I went ahead and thought to myself, well, I really think this Persian stuff is interesting, and Alexander goes through Persia, so maybe I should focus instead on what he's encountering, not militarily, but politically, socially,
Yeah.
culturally, while he's in Persia. And
It's a lot more open.
yeah,
So you
yeah.
dove into it. Yeah.
Yeah, but the problem there is that then you're running into what is essentially a second discipline.
Yes.
Yeah, so I figured out, that there are a whole different set of experts who have written on some of this stuff,
Hmm.
and that there were a few cuneiform documents that talked about Alexander's time in these areas. And then I got it in my head that I had to learn cuneiform. I just had to.
But
Even
this
though
is leading to the other question I'm going to ask you. How the hell did you wind up with two PhDs?
yeah, yeah. So here's another story is I started to figure out that I wanted to, get into the sort of ancient Mesopotamian history so that I could contextualize Alexander's encounters with these people in a productive way.
Hmm.
Um, so I went to a lecture on the Epic of Gilgamesh that was attached to a very crunchy performance of the Epic of Gilgamesh because it was performed by a flautist and an artist who drew Gilgamesh in real time while the flautist was performing Gilgamesh. So it was musical, it was artistic, but it wasn't really theatrical. It wasn't
Yeah.
like what you would think Gilgamesh would look like. But
Yeah.
there was a lecture beforehand by an individual who would end up becoming my one of my Dr. Fathers. There's a lot of them. Um, Piotr Michałowski. And it was one of those moments as a student where you listen to a lecture by a professor and you just are so captivated that there is nothing else you can think about in life ever again. And so that's the second time I marched over to Sarah Forsdyke's office and I said, listen, I know I'm getting a PhD in Greek and Roman history here, but I need to get a master's in ancient Near Eastern history and cuneiform studies if I'm going to be happy. I just have to do it. And she said, okay, you can do that. That's allowed. And so I started to spend more time in ancient Near Eastern studies at Michigan. I started learning cuneiform. I learned Akkadian and Sumerian, and I finished the dissertation, but it was pretty clear by the time I was finished that I needed to continue that study and finish another PhD in Assyriology because while I had the ability to read Akkadian and Sumerian, and I had some background in Mesopotamian history, I didn't feel like it was enough for me to consider myself an expert and to bring it into my Alexander studies in a productive way.
Yeah.
Um, so the nice thing is that there are some European countries that don't mind, even expect you to get two PhDs. And I found a program in Munich called Distant Worlds that accepted me into their Assyriology program. And I went there, and that was a whole different kind of challenge because all of the coursework was in German. You had to take a full course load. I received the acceptance like 6 weeks after I had to arrive, or before I had to arrive. And so I had no time to learn spoken German. I had no time. I had to get married so that my then boyfriend could come with me. And so it was just kind of a whirlwind of
Yeah.
stuff. But and to top that all off, the Germans have a completely different way of talking about Akkadian and Sumerian grammar and syntax. So I essentially had to learn the languages again.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
it
Okay.
was,
Yeah.
but that was
And they're
great.
not, yeah, and they're not easy to begin with. I mean, I
Mm-mm.
can't even, I no. Languages
Yeah,
are not
yeah.
my jam. So,
Yeah, yeah. So that, but it ended up being a very valuable experience because that is when I really understood the languages, is because I had to learn them twice in two different ways.
yeah.
And so that was great. And I had a great thesis supervisor there, Walter Salaberger. But the thing is that, if you're going to
How long were
do
you in Munich?
two
How long were
years,
you? 2 years? Okay.
yep. So I took a full course load. I took I they paid for me to learn how to speak German, which didn't happen as well as I wanted it to, but it happened. Um, and they allowed me to write the thesis in English so that I could get it done more quickly.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so, in the German system, you have to publish the thesis in order for them to consider you a doctor.
Oh, wow.
And so they do often sort of hurry you through that publishing
Yeah.
process. And so I graduated in 2015 and got my first job in America. And then that book from the thesis in Munich was published in 2017. So it was a long road, but I like to think about that second PhD as if it was kind of a postdoc because it was quite short, and it really helped me
I
sort
love
of.
your book too. The one
Oh,
you
yeah.
that you,
Okay.
that you
This
have.
is the first one. So De Gruyter is a German publisher, so this was kind of a clear place to put the book. But I worked with Gonzalo Rubio at Penn State, who is the editor for Studies in Ancient Near Eastern Records. And this book is about how scholars in the first millennium Assyrian Empire used sort of ideological and programmatic language associated with royal inscriptions to just slightly push back against royal rhetoric. So it's sort of a counter discourse
Yeah.
study. And a lot of people have asked me, like, what does that have to do with anything that you do now? And the answer is that it's about power projection. It's about
Quite a
how,
lot.
yeah, it's about how kings produce narratives of power and how other people receive them. And that's really sort of, in a nutshell, what I do in various time periods. And that's what I did also with the second book, which was not it really doesn't have anything to do with that first thesis from Michigan, because that was a piece of what I like to call juvenilia. It really wasn't developed, I mean, most dissertations aren't, right? I mean, you really have to work on them, but I would estimate that the Alexander book that came out in 2022, I can show you that one. That's this. This was at the University of Michigan Press. This book I probably wrote three or four separate times. I mean, it really was a labor of love. But I'm really happy with the way that book came out. So yeah, I mean, it's been kind of a long journey, but I was really lucky to get a job straight out of graduate school. And so I was
Yes.
at Marquette University for 6 years before I came to Loyola, and now I'm starting my fifth year at Loyola. So I just have a privilege to be able to teach and research in ancient history. It's been a great time so far. So
I want to touch on the thing you say that you do hard things, like hard things, to
yeah,
go into the very next question because something that I discovered once I got to know you, and I found Jen after reading one of her articles, and I was so excited I had to email her. She probably
you
remembers
did?
this.
What was it?
I was the one on the trilingual
Oh,
inscriptions
okay,
because
okay.
I was working. This is where I'm working on the Branchii stuff, and I
Okay.
was trying to find my way through this because I am not an ancient Near Eastern person. I
Yeah.
love the Sargonids in their bloody way,
Yeah.
but but I I teach that class. I don't research that. And those are two very different things. And I'm not sure people understand just how
Yeah.
different that is, the
Yeah.
depth and just me trying to figure out. And oh my God, all this stuff is in German, damn it.
Yep.
Anyway, so I remember reading your article. It's like finally something that's in English, and oh, this is really good. And oh, I
Uh,
can email her. And so anyway. But yeah, so sometimes, we get excited about stuff. But you are a competitive runner and a triathlete. You're also a mom. So you're
mm,
juggling all these other things.
hmm
Um, and doing that too, at least the mom part, and then, my own fiction writing and stuff, which is this whole other little thing. How do you find that you, I don't know, bring these together if you bring them together? I know sometimes I'll be thinking about one thing that then bangs off something else that I'm thinking about in academia, or I'm doing something else entirely, I'm beating or something, and this is all going on in the back of my brain. So
hmm
you like doing hard things. I couldn't begin to run a marathon, man. But how, what do you do with, talk about that a little bit? Because that to me is really intriguing. That we do have lives outside of our academic stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So I would say, that marathoning, particularly in graduate school, was my chosen drug of coping. Lots of people know, I think, and if they don't, I think it's really important to say it, that at least 50% of graduate students have serious mental health issues because it's a very difficult process. I mean, you're under
Yeah.
a lot of pressure all the
And a lot
time.
don't finish.
A
That's
lot of
why.
people don't finish.
ABD, all but
Yep.
dissertation. Yeah.
Yeah, you can have, problems with your advisors. Luckily, I didn't have that, but a lot of people do.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things that can cause stress during
Yeah.
those periods. For me, I felt like I was not going to be productive unless I gave some time to myself every day. And as it happens, when I'm running or riding or swimming or whatever it is, I think a lot about my work. And I have, a lot of people have good ideas in the shower. Sometimes that happens to me too. But when you're out there running for hours, you're inevitably going to work through some problems that you've been
Yeah.
thinking about.
Yeah.
And the nice thing is that you don't have access to your notes. You don't have access
Right.
to books.
Right.
You have nothing except for your own thoughts about the project. And so I'm sure people are laughing because I'm running down the sidewalk saying, "Oh yeah, that could work. Oh wait, but I forgot
You
about
talk to yourself too. That's good
this."
to know. It's not just me.
Yeah, yeah. And it sometimes it used to happen, especially when I was in graduate school, that I'd wake up in the middle of the night with like what I thought was this amazing idea and I'd have to write it down. So I kept like a notepad by my bed. And every time it was a non-starter idea. But
Yeah. Right.
still,
Your brain's doing something with it. Yeah.
it's working all the time. And also I think, there's something about endorphins and all of this other stuff that help you think better. I don't really know about all of that, but I just really enjoy it. And if I don't, enjoy, and I do it in the morning so that I feel like I've started my day and I'm fresh and everything is recharged and sort of ready. And awake,
Yeah.
so because
Yeah.
it's kind of hard to like sleep through a run. So, yeah, I mean, that's
Yeah, I
just
have
kind of
my coffee and get on the elliptical then, not at the same
exactly.
time, but yeah, it
Yeah,
makes your heart go. It makes, wakes you up. So,
it does. It does.
yeah.
Yeah. So, and the interesting thing is that I have always liked electronic dance music. I am huge
Okay.
onto that, and I always have been. I mean, I was going to raves when I was like 18 or something, and I also work to that music, and I run to that music, and everybody says, "Oh, I don't know how you do that," but it's like a steady sort of
Yeah.
you know a rhythm, and if
Mhm.
and it can translate into writing and
Mhm.
translating and all sorts of things. So yeah, I mean, I think too that like I told my husband when we had the kids, I'm not going to mom unless I have my time to work out. And I
Mhm.
think the same thing is true with my research. Like I need to do that in order to have good ideas. And when you want to do so many things, you have to become very efficient. And so
Yeah.
Every hour, there's no wasted time in my day. I just get things done more quickly than I ever had before, and that's because if you have to do it, you do it.
Right. Right.
And so I don't think that anything is impossible for an academic or a student or anyone. You know, you if you make time for yourself, suddenly more time, will appear in your day, and you'll become more efficient with it. I mean, that's what I really think.
Yeah, I think the efficiency, learning to be more efficient with your time, because I can find I can waste loads of time if I'm not paying attention. But if I want to get stuff done, and I remember, and you had yours after I unexpectedly got pregnant while I was trying to write the dissertation. And Gene says he remembers me walking into his office and telling him I'm pregnant, and he thought, he was an older guy. Oh, she's done, you know. And I told him, no, no. In my brain, it was suddenly like, I have until he is 5 months old and crawling to get this thing done. And all that did was lit a fire under me because I now had an end date, to
Yep.
get this done. And
Yep.
sometimes that helps me. And I
Yeah,
think it depends.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I still do that. I put
Yeah.
self-imposed deadlines on
Yes, I do
myself.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I say, this needs to get done by March 30th so that I can continue on to this next project, and that works for me. It doesn't work for some people.
Right. Yeah.
But that's you have to learn how to be self-motivating in graduate
Yes.
school
Oh,
already because
absolutely. Yeah,
yeah, and
absolutely.
that's a skill that you have to continue as a scholar, because it's not an easy career because you're
Mhm.
always under a lot of pressure to publish, to keep your
Yeah.
job, to get good evaluations on your teaching, scores and whatever. And the thing that I've always found most difficult about this job is that all of those scores, all of those reviews of your written work, all of those reviews of your teaching, they're subjective.
Right.
Your career depends on subjective evaluations of your work, and sometimes those don't align with your own opinions about your work. So I think
Yeah.
that can be really difficult to
Mhm.
wrestle with.
Right. Yeah. Learning, I think learning a certain amount of, um, I don't care what you think, I'm going to keep doing it anyway, can matter.
Hmm.
Keep you going, keep you going.
Yeah, yeah. But not taking things personally is really hard.
Yes,
I
it
mean,
is.
that's hard for everybody, and it's
Right.
kind of a skill that you learn over time, but even, as you get older and more experienced, it can still, hurt your feelings a little bit if
Oh, yeah.
somebody,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah. It doesn't go away. Okay, so pulling us in, and we already talked a little bit about your books, but I want to, and we'll get to the one you're working on next in a minute. But with the second one,
Mhm.
that's on Alexander, what I really liked about it was how you deal with how Alexander's remembered, and just memory in general, and how, in your first book, you're talking about um, projections of power, okay, and how that manipulates as well. And in the second one, you're talking about how this powerful individual is then repurposed
Hmm.
into new narratives.
Yeah.
And one of the things from my former life in psychology that I remember talking and talking with friends and folks who do a lot more with memory work, that most of us have a really mistaken idea about memory. And you probably ran into this in doing your own research, that there's this idea that there's some pure memory of things, and using hypnosis to get at it. It's like, no, if you don't remember something in hypnosis, you make it up.
Hmm.
Okay. And that's actually a false narrative, that we remember what we remember because we tell it and retell it, or it's told to us. I've always looked at Alexander's Bucephalus story as that way, that must have been cute. People told him, he then retold it, and then Plutarch retells it again,
Yeah.
So these are
Yeah.
always repurposed. And so chase that a little bit. How are our sources manipulating? And not and I want to say manipulation isn't always negative.
Yep.
You know,
Yeah.
I think there's this idea of you're lying. We're always lying ourselves, and how we make meaning out of the chaos.
Yeah.
So talk some about that. Pick a couple of examples or something from the book, or whatever you want to deal with, and talk about memory.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is a perennial problem in Alexander studies, right? Is that we don't really have full narratives of his campaign that we can trust wholly. Even even if, let's just say, his court historian Callisthenes, all of this, the history of the deeds of Alexander, or Peri Alexandru, or whatever it was
Yeah.
supposed to be called, had actually survived, even that would have been full of flattery,
Yes.
full of yeah, so these
The
sort of
official
grandiose.
document. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even that, because it would have had to be signed off by Alexander himself, and he was an autocrat who had an idea about how he wanted to be presented to the
Yep.
public. And so,
Yep.
that even that contemporary document would have been hard to trust. And so what we come into, as Alexander scholars, is that most of our fuller narratives are written during the Roman period. And, that's upwards of 300 years following, Alexander's death. And so what we're really working with,
Yeah.
yeah, what we're really working with is a whole bunch of altered, manipulated, adopted, and, just sort of skewed memories of what happened. And one of the things that I struggled with the first time I wrote this book is that I wrote it as a narrative of how Alexander tried to represent himself based on how he wanted to be seen. And the
Mhm.
reviewers said, listen, we can't know that. We just
Mhm.
can't know how this guy wanted himself to be seen by the public. We just can't know it. And so then I realized, I said to myself, okay, that's right. The only thing that we can know is how Roman authors represented him in their narratives. And the really important thing about that is that we have to place those Roman authors in their social and cultural context.
Yep.
So what is happening, when these people are writing about Alexander? Well, we have Diodorus who's writing about Alexander and many other things, by the way.
Yeah.
Essentially at this really important crux at the end of the Republic, when it looks like we're about to have an autocrat for the first time in,
Mhm.
500 years. And then we have these imperial writers who are firmly living, under these new Roman emperors. And so we have to think about what they're seeing in real time and how
Yeah.
that might affect the way that they're interpreting Alexander. And so the book really focuses mostly on this crucial moment that I identify as the reign of Augustus, because he is the first Roman emperor. They had had a republic, since 509 BCE. He, comes onto the scene, he sort of comes storming onto the scene, although, he had this precedent set for him ahead of time about, what one man rule could look like in Rome. And he just takes the bull by the horns and takes Rome for his own. And the great example of how to be a successful military man, a politician, and a strategist, holding sway over a humongous, piece of land and lots of different diverse peoples, was Alexander the Great. And so it made sense to me. There have been lots of studies done on Alexander imitatio. So,
This,
people
for
who,
instance, yeah. Diana
yeah,
Spencer. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right, exactly. So, Diana Spencer's book, The Roman Alexander, is really the first great
Yeah.
comprehensive study of how this is done. And so we have individuals like Pompey, Caesar, Octavian, later Augustus, and lots of Roman emperors, including the really weird, crazy ones, who think that Alexander is the guy. He's the person that you have to emulate if you want to be a successful autocrat. And so what I found is that as they're producing narratives about their own reigns, and in particular for me, Augustus, they pick out moments in Alexander's campaigns that were significant for him and could be translated in a Roman context with something that had happened in Roman history, such that it appears that there's this sort of inevitable thread between Alexander and the Romans, that this was always sort of determined to be the course of history, that, Augustus was always meant to be the first man at Rome, just like Alexander, was the first man of the Persian Empire. And so what I found is that, for instance, one of the really famous I think everyone will probably know this if they've seen 300, although I'm finding that a lot of people have not seen 300
Yeah.
anymore.
It's
That
not, it's
generation is
not,
kind of past.
yes, it is. Yep.
Um, is that, the major sort of propagandistic memory creating narrative for Spartan military history was the battle at Thermopylae, even though, interestingly, of course, they're defeated there. But
Yep.
we can conveniently forget that because this is a glory moment. And
An Alamo, you know?
yeah, exactly, exactly. And what happens is that the Romans also fight a battle at Thermopylae in their sort of march towards possession over some of these Greek territories. And so it starts to feel like fighting at Thermopylae is a sort of prerequisite for greatness. And what I found is that, and this is, of course, with help from lots of articles, for instance, by Tim Howe and Sabina Mueller, that that battle is sort of written in a very literary way into one of Alexander's battles, such that it looks like the Spartans went to Thermopylae, and then Alexander did it, and then the Romans did it. And so very clearly the Romans are the great successors of, these past uh, great military, dynasties. And so they create that narrative for Alexander so that the Romans can fit into it. And they do similar things, with other stories associated with Alexander. So, for instance, Diodorus, he writes about these journeys of Heracles, and what ends up happening is, he paints Heracles as if he is the hero who conquers land and sea. And it appears in a very similar way to Alexander's so-called last plans.
Mhm.
Um, and the really interesting thing is that those last plans, according to Diodorus, who's really our only good source for this, which is always suspect if that happens, those last plans look very much like things that Augustus says he does or is going to do in his sort of self-image. Particularly in the Res Gestae, we see this. He says, I'm conquering land and sea. For instance, one of the things associated with Alexander's last plans is the building of this great pyre monument for Hephaestion, and that it's interesting because it shows up in Diodorus as sort of like a pyramidal structure,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
And oh boy, do I want to have fun with that. But keep going.
yeah, and like, where did he get this idea? Like, how did this, and then I'm looking because I have my head focused on Augustus. And as it turns out, there's this pyramid structure. I mean, he builds a mausoleum. There's a pyramid structure right next to it, which was built, I think, by Cestius. And that's associated with, Augustus's family. And all of a sudden, all of these last plans that really look like they're kind of invented by Diodorus seem to line up with Augustus's own propaganda. And
Mhm.
and so it looks like he has really adopted Alexander in a way that he's not explicit about in every aspect. but we can see that through the sources that are writing either during, his initial part of his reign or afterwards. So it really seems like there is a pivotal moment where when an autocrat is coming into, what used to be a sort of representative democracy and looking for an example, it is Alexander. And so then if we re-look at all of these narratives about Alexander's reign, they start to look different. When we start to say to ourselves, oh my gosh, like what of this is actually Roman only? And what of this happened, in 330 BCE? And we start to question like what actually happened during the reign of Alexander. Now it's getting very confusing. So at the end of the book, I end up saying, like we now have more questions than we have answers about what happened during
Yeah.
Alexander's reign. So,
Yes, Macedonia is not a democracy of any sort or a republic. It
mhm,
was always, and that I keep hammering home to people, is it was always an absolute monarchy, and Alexander's the end. And so
mhm,
it's really interesting how they're repurposing him as a beginning. And I guess,
mhm,
yeah, sure, you could say the beginning in Persia thing, but still,
mhm.
I'm fascinated by that conflict, and
Yeah.
you dig into that, and you dig into how they're remembering and repurposing him.
And I
So
mean, the
nothing but
Romans don't care about inconsistency. I
no,
mean, they
no, no, no. This is not a problem for them. It's just interesting to me how they're taking this, which from if you were trying to get back to Macedonia, well, sure, of course he's an autocrat. But
Mhm.
for the Romans, he then becomes useful. Anyway, sorry, I'm just repeating what you just said, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's yeah, yeah.
It was fun to write. It was really fun to write, but then, it leaves some people feeling frustrated that we actually have more
Right,
questions
right,
now
right.
than we have
Yeah,
answers.
yeah, I
Um,
get that a lot from students. It's like, but you're basically tearing everything apart, and it's like, hi, welcome to ancient history.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I do have stressed out students say to me like, what can we believe? I mean, especially if we have competing narratives of a
Right.
single
Yeah.
event, it's very difficult, to
Yes.
reconcile those things. And to some
Yeah.
people, that's very frustrating. But really,
Right.
what it is, it's investigative reporting. I mean, that's what we're
Right. Yeah.
doing. And one of the great things is that we're just not going to know. So the only thing that we can do is have friendly scholarly dialogue and have fun with it.
Right.
You know?
Exactly. Oh, you
Yeah,
said that. What do you think about that? And yeah,
exactly.
whenever I had Sabina on, I told her, we were talking about Perdiccas because I love her book on Perdiccas, but I told her, we need to get together sometime and go back and forth about Hephaestion and show people how we reach different conclusions because of
Mm.
how we are framing and thinking about the evidence.
Yes.
And that we still friends. We still like each other very much,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
that's fine. I'm not going to agree with her on some things. I totally agree with her on others, and that's how it goes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's scholarship.
Well,
So
I love seeing different approaches. I mean, and
yeah,
and the thing is, it's really interesting that you bring up Sabina because I had written an article on Alexander's return of the Tyrannicide statues
right,
to
yeah,
Athens. The statues of Hermodius and Aristogeiton were discovered in
mhm.
Susa, so they were. I just find this really fascinating that Mesopotamian kings over long periods of time had sort of created this like collection of historical items in their
British
capital.
Museum.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it is. It's the British Museum. And
Yeah.
and that's really sort of what I'm working on now is this sort of like this collecting and what does that
Yeah.
collecting look like and
Oh,
how is it read
yeah.
and perceived?
This is a good bridge into that then. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So
So I had written this article about how he had done this in a very ancient Near Eastern mode, and he was trying to emulate Mesopotamian kings before him. And Sabina came out with an article, I think maybe it was like the next year, that completely tore down my argument,
mhm.
although I don't think she ever saw that
Yeah.
article.
No, I don't either.
Um, and I thought to myself, oh my God, she's right. She's 100% right. And but for me, I think that's okay to
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
two completely separate viewpoints on the same event out there. People can decide what pieces of evidence they find to be more convincing,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
and, and that's
Yeah.
great. I mean, it just shows the
And
this
we can
is
change our minds.
absolutely, and
I
you
have
shouldn't be
certainly on
embarrassed about
things.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that bothers me. This whole notion that, oh, well, you're not, you're not a real scholar, or you change your mind. That's like, no, that's what we do. That's the
Yeah.
goal.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
anyway,
We
yeah.
sometimes we get more sources, sometimes
Yeah.
new, papyri emerge, or we're just very convinced by new approaches to the same subject, or some kind of dialogue we're having with someone else, and that's fine.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's have fun then with collections and touring and other
Yes.
stuff. In that I know this is kind of where you're moving today. And I remember hearing about it way back in grad school with my Roman professor talking about the Romans and the Egyptians and the Roman penchant for running off with things.
Hmm.
Kind of like the Persians and others possibly.
Yeah.
Ancient tourism was a thing, just like it is now. So and whenever I teach on Alexander, also the thing I point out to the students is Alexander's always struck me, wrongly or rightly, as an approach kind of person. And I tend to think people approach or repel from the world. That is, they find new things interesting or they find them, scary.
Hmm.
And I've always thought about Alexander as being one of those who find it interesting. I want to know more about that. So, I jokingly call him Lewis and Army instead of Lewis and Clark. And that's not to put aside the conquest thing because it's, oh, well, he didn't really, yes, he absolutely wanted to conquer things. That's the goal. But he
Hmm.
also liked looking at things. So run with it, Jen. What are you finding in this idea of ancient tourism?
Yeah, I mean, so I want to just sort of say from the outset, I've always believed that Alexander was very well read,
Mhm.
that he had a lot of exposure to other cultures even before his
Mhm.
arrival in Persia. So I
Yeah.
do think that he had a pretty good idea, even if it was, erroneous. Let's just say he read Herodotus' book two on Egypt. Maybe that wasn't the best source, but he still got information. I mean, so I still think that, Alexander was very well read. And he makes up a chapter in this next book that I'm writing, which is called The Great Man's Grand Tour. And the idea is that I'm sort of taking the model of the grand tour that elites would do in Europe in the 16th to 18th century, where they would go around to antiquarian sites. So, sites that they believed to have been of great ancient history, to be of great import for one reason or another, mostly historically. So they'll go to Paris, they'll go to Rome, they'll go to Athens, and this is a way for them to sort of establish their elite identity, is to partake in this kind of tourism. But one of the things that is really interesting, and this is mostly in association with monarchs in the UK. There is a sort of sub-brand of this kind of tourism, and that's royal tourism.
Mhm.
So, what I'm really sort of interested in here is how one-man rulers in the ancient world, from the Near East all the way to Rome, used this idea of adopting or co-opting some of these pre-existing cultural heritage sites or creating cultural heritage sites of their own to create these sort of mental maps of the boundaries of their empires,
Mhm.
so that when people go to visit them, they'll say, oh, this is very clearly a new building of Alexander, and that means that this territory is part of his empire, and that the people have accepted him. In some very rare instances, in the late Roman period, we hear about tour guides even, for instance, at Troy. This is a very popular
Yeah.
destination. Um, and how those sort of mental maps are used to create power. And a lot of that can happen through collections into sort of centralized spaces like Susa that we just talked about. The Library at Alexandria is another great example of this. That there are ways of using cultural heritage by these sort of autocrats to as a sort of soft power, if you will, propaganda technique. And so for Alexander, what I've really sort of found is that, we're going to get a lot of these sort of standard touristy things that a lot of people have talked about. So, for instance, he goes to Troy. We know a lot about this, Trojan emulation narrative. Some people think that it's all garbage. It's all sort of Roman invention, that he just wanted to look like, or the Romans wanted him to look like a new Achilles, et cetera, et cetera. But we know, that he goes to Gordian and he cuts the Gordian knot. We know that he goes to the Temple of Ammon in Siwa. But there are other places too. So, for instance, he goes to the tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae, and he restores it. We know that he makes orders. We know this from cuneiform documents, so this is really nice because they can be biased, but they're more likely not to be. We know that he puts in orders for the restoration of the ziggurat to Marduk at Babylon. And, he supposedly goes to a bunch of places, that, like, for instance, Nysa, associated with Dionysus. So he seems to have a penchant for recognizing places that are important to both sort of local cultures, but also to the sort of memory of people in Greece and Macedon. And, manipulating those cultural heritage sites to his own benefit, to show that he is respectful of these cultures, to project his power in varied kinds of ways. So, for instance, at Siwa, he essentially appears as an Egyptian pharaoh. He does all of the things that Egyptian pharaohs are supposed to do. And all of this is done in a very sort of calculated effort to present himself as a global conqueror. And if you sort of map out all of these cultural heritage sites that he visits, not only do they sort of present the boundaries of his empire, but they also become standard tourist sites that later rulers will go to not only associate themselves with Alexander, which is clearly an important thing for them to do, but also to demarcate the boundaries of their own empires. So Augustus, for instance, will go to Alexandria and associate himself with Alexander's tomb, wherever that is, and as a way to, show the constituents of Alexandria, but also the people back home in Rome, that he is a successor to Alexander and that Egypt is his. So it does kind of have this double purpose, this kind of tourism, and it's just been a really kind of
Oh,
interesting project.
he
Yeah, go
toured
ahead.
he toured Nineveh too before the
Yeah,
Battle of Gaugamela. Yeah, I
yeah,
remember that. Yeah.
yes, yeah. And one of the things that a lot of people don't talk about is he is said also to have restored temple at Luxor. And then also he went to Smyrna, which we never really hear about. And I think the reason that he probably did that, I think this is in Plutarch, is because it was known as the home of Homer. And so he really has an eye out for some of these historical or literary figures that he admires or knows is important to the sort of memory heritage of the people who are watching him, and he speaks to that identity, and that's a smart thing to do.
Right. It's all part of that curating of his image, of thinking about how do I want
Yep,
people to
exactly.
see me? Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think it's really important that we not only look at Alexander as a conqueror, but also as an intellectual. I mean, he's really
Mhm.
doing this in a very careful, methodological way. And he understands that he has so many different constituents that he has to speak to. And the way to do that is to strike at their heart, which is their cultural heritage. And that kind of approach is adopted by, in different ways after him. So I argue in the book too that, for instance, the Seven Wonders of the Ancient World list is essentially the same thing. That this is the successors of Alexander sort of picking out the sites that are most important and also associated with Alexander's reign to give themselves legitimacy in this sort of topsy-turvy world. And then Augustus really steps it up a notch because not only does he make these sort of tours and restores temples, does a lot of the same things that Alexander does, but he also creates pieces or he commissions pieces of literature like the Aeneid that also does that work for him. So he does it in lots of different media to really produce a comprehensive program. I mean, and not only that, I mean, the map of Agrippa is commissioned under his reign and it's posted publicly. So he's not just creating a mental map, but also a physical map for people to look at of how big his empire is. So this kind of behavior is expanding over time, is the argument.
Yeah. And that fits into, I think you mentioned at the beginning, you were talking about royal tourism
Mhm.
as, structuring. And you've got another case with Augustus of a really smart, well-read, well-educated guy
Mhm.
who pays a lot of attention to his image and how that image is going to be perceived.
Right.
And so, well, Alexander's a good choice. In the royal tourism, the other one that always comes to my mind, I don't know if you look at him, is Hadrian.
Hmm. Of course,
Uh,
yeah.
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 So, and I'm sure he's not the only way. It's just that's the next one that really leaps to my mind if I've got to go here and here and here and here,
Yeah.
all over the place.
Yeah.
But yeah, so talk some about that royal tourism. You already have a little bit, but I mean more broadly, how are you seeing them? That paradigm as you put it.
Yeah, I mean, I argue in the book that it actually starts in the ancient Near East.
Okay.
And of course,
Who do you
I
start with?
would.
And yeah.
So we get a little bit of this, for instance, during the Assyrian period, but
Okay.
when it really becomes a common practice is during the Neo-Babylonian period. So Nabonidus does this. He's
Okay.
often called sort of the first archaeologist because he goes to different sites and he leaves inscriptions saying, "Hey, I dug here and I found something really ancient." And then I left my name here. Please don't destroy the things, so he implants his name on some of these things, and the reason it's a lot of religious sites in the ancient Near East, but it's also tombs, and so that's why I think the visit to the tomb at Pasargadae is really interesting because it looks very much like a royal event for an ancient Near Eastern king. And the same thing is true for the restoration at Luxor, the restoration of the ziggurat to Marduk, because in the ancient Near Eastern period, a lot of this behavior, this tourism, is associated with rebuilding and restoration.
Yeah, you
Um,
build things. That's what kings do.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And you leave your name on them and you say,
Yes, you
I
know,
made
yes,
this more
yes.
beautiful. Like Nebuchadnezzar II does this whole thing with
Yeah,
Babylon. He puts his
yeah.
name on all the bricks in Babylon. By the way, Saddam Hussein, when he rebuilds Babylon, he does the same thing.
Okay.
And so, he put his name in Arabic on the bricks at the restored Babylon. So this practice has actually continued over the course of a very long period of time. Um, and so I think that these ancient Near Eastern kings are starting this behavior. They're creating this precedent where you travel outside of the confines of your capital. You make this sort of, it's not quite the itinerant court that the Achaemenids
Okay.
have, but they're moving around more and they're
Mhm.
making their presence known in those sites. And so I think
Yeah.
that's when things really start. And Alexander watches this. One of the things that's really interesting to me, actually, is that I wanted to do this project on one man rule. And so it's like, oh, well, I have to leave the Greeks out of it because they just don't have, they get rid of the tyrants. And so they don't have this kind of stuff. But actually, they do. So the Odyssey is very clearly a travel narrative. And we talk a lot about Alexander in the Iliad. But we don't talk enough about Alexander in the Odyssey. I do wonder, our sources don't say, oh, he had all the works of Homer with him. We know that he had the Iliad with him, but I have to assume, with Aristotle being his tutor, and all of the other things he's read, that he had read the Odyssey. And I do wonder, if he doesn't, imagine himself as this kind of this traveling explorer.
I,
Um,
I, I think he does. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and so I think what I ended up doing is keeping Greece in there because they do set a precedent for this sort of travel narrative at the very least. Herodotus does
The
this,
original
obviously.
road trip,
Yeah,
story. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
yes, the original road trip, yes. And so they do have these sort of literary narratives, but then they also do some other really interesting things, like they collect the bones of the founders of
Yeah.
cities. So there
Yeah.
are some collection practices happening. So
Hmm.
it's not as if it disappears altogether. It just sort of appears in a different way.
Yeah.
And there are collecting activities too, like maybe if you believe that Pisistratus made the first library
Yes.
at Athens, this
Yeah.
is not something to be ignored.
I was thinking of his trip out to so-called find the bones of Theseus and bring them back.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes.
So, yeah.
And so there are these, I like the way you term it, the road trip. I mean, it's really important for these people to go on those road trips, to collect those,
Yeah.
cultural heritage items, to make everybody know that they've seen this in person and that they've helped to reconstruct it, because that creates power projection
Yeah.
in, areas
Absolutely.
peripheral, to the urban cities that they tend to hang out in. So yeah, I mean, I think that it starts with the ancient Near East and it goes. I mean, the Hippodrome at Constantinople is a really great example of this. I mean, even to the end of the Roman Empire, when Constantine moves the capital, he essentially takes all of history and just drops it into the Hippodrome. And I mean, there's a obelisk there. There's like milestones from Rome. I mean, everything is in there, and so this is a consistent practice for
Yeah.
autocrats over the entirety of the ancient period, which is why I'm having a lot of trouble finishing the book because it is a lot of information. And everybody's doing it. But I think, Alexander follows very closely on the heels of ancient Near Eastern kings in doing some of these things.
I've always thought that there is a lot of intentionality for Alexander. He's not doing this accidentally.
Yeah.
He's hearing there. We don't know what he's hearing, but he's there. He's hearing people talk about it. He's seeing this stuff. And that's got to have affected him. He may not always understand what he's hearing. It's certainly not
Mhm.
in an ancient Near Eastern lens, but he's hearing it. So, oh, I want to do that too. So I think
Mhm.
that's a big part of it.
Well, and probably at the very least, somebody is telling him it's really important for you to do this kind of
Yeah.
thing
Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
want to be accepted by X, Y, and Z, population in this area.
Especially after you burn Persepolis.
Yeah, yeah, maybe we need to do something for the locals, what I mean?
Yeah. I need
So
to do some fixing of my image here.
yeah, I mean, I think,
Oh,
I mean, that
yeah.
just goes to show, though, right? Like, he does do things without thinking because we
Right.
tend to
Yeah.
forget that he's in his 20s.
Right.
You
I
know, and
know. I know. Yes.
he's
Yes.
just a kid, I mean, and so he is getting drunk and burning things, and he is getting drunk and he's having adult temper tantrums at Tyre, like he's doing those kinds of things. But then he is sometimes thinking in great detail about how to extend, his image to other people. I mean, yeah, he's running into battle with the Achilles helmet on, like that's stupid. You're going to be very conspicuous. But in other instances, he seems pretty bent on employing, his cultural knowledge to help his political stance.
And both of those things can be true at once. And that's what I
Mhm.
think people forget. human beings aren't consistent. We're very inconsistent. And so, yes, you've got a 20-year-old kid who's obviously very sharp, but he's still in his 20s. He's what, 26 at Gaugamela? I mean,
It's
what was I doing at
incredible.
26?
Incredible if you think about it. It's
Yeah,
really incredible.
yeah. Um, all right, so wrapping up, and so we don't go too long, with the tourism thing. So if you could pick a place to go in the ancient world and be dropped in, where would you go? What would you want to see?
Oh, oh boy.
I
Is
know
this
that's a
one?
really hard question. It's like,
Well,
what's your favorite book? On what
yeah.
day and what hour of the day? So,
Is this a place I've never been before or a place I
okay.
have been before?
Either, it doesn't matter. I mean, a place that you would have loved to have toured. No, and I don't mean now. I mean in its heyday.
Babylon.
Okay, Babylon. All right, fair
Yeah.
enough.
I've been to Persepolis, and
Uh-huh.
frankly, you know, even now, it is still, you can still feel the majesty. Like you really can. And so, Babylon is really just a smattering of what it once was. And I would have loved to see Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon
Yeah,
in its
yeah.
heyday. Like I don't even care if the Hanging Gardens aren't really there. Like
Right, right.
the rest of
Amazing.
it is incredible. I'm sure of it. And I really think that it would have been amazing.
Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for coming and chatting and talking tourism and Alexander and other things. So once more, hold up your books so people can see
Oh,
them.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. This
And yeah,
one's good
so
to
you can
if you need to sleep. This one's a little better.
I like that one. Yeah, I like that one. I may be biased, but I like that one. So, all right.
Thank
So
you for
we'll
inviting me. It was
sure
wonderful to
thing.
talk to you.
Sure thing. Okay.